On the night of 10 January 1961, or, in some accounts, in the early hours of 11 January 1961, a small group of Moroccan Jews moved quietly through the darkness toward the Gulf of Al-Husaymas, near Al-Hoceima. The record preserves the vessel's name more clearly than the faces. Pisces, later remembered as Egos, a boat used by Mossad, the Mossad's underground framework in Morocco, to move people toward Gibraltar while emigration remained illegal. There is no confirmed map of the exact beach path, no verified list of who held which child's hand. What remains is the shape of the moment. Families waiting in cold air, papers kept dry against the body. At sea, the calm broke fast, and the cost arrived before any victory could be claimed. In 1954, in Casablanca, a small Hebrew-learning kindergarten and Ulpan operated in plain sight. Parents, children, notebooks, the ordinary hum of a weekday. Later accounts describe this space as something else too, a hiding place for weapons connected to Mossad, the clandestine Zionist apparatus established by the Mossad that would operate in Morocco through the early 1960s. The point was not drama. The point was invisibility, an institution that looked normal enough to be ignored. The record names Yehudit Galili, an envoy of the Jewish Agency, as central to this early node running the educational cover, building relationships with families, later joining the framework as recruiter and operative. A later institutional account notes that by 1954, Israeli security representatives were already assessing conditions, led by Colonel Shlomo Havilio. What it does not preserve is the address, the floor plan, the exact sequence of who entered which door. The building stood somewhere in the Mela, or beyond it, the old Jewish quarter of Casablanca, where narrow streets and shared courtyards allowed for the kind of privacy that surveillance struggled to penetrate. In a dossier sense, this is how a covert pipeline begins. Not with a chase, but with a room where people learn to speak, and where trust is built one parent at a time. The kindergarten functioned as interface between Israeli intent and Moroccan Jewish aspiration, between public normalcy and hidden purpose. Parents brought children to learn Hebrew letters. The letters spelled something larger than alphabet. The teachers themselves often did not know the full scope of what their classroom concealed. The sensory reality of that cover life remains partially documented. Chalk dust on small hands, recitation of vocabulary, the smell of mint tea offered to visiting mothers, the sound of children's voices repeating syllables while adults spoke in quieter tones about departures and destinations. These ordinary textures made the extraordinary possible. Windows faced the street. Anyone could look in and see education happening. That was precisely the intention, a surface so unremarkable that no official would think to search the storage closet or question why certain adults came and went at irregular hours. A cover life is not a mask you put on once. It is a routine you repeat until it feels like truth. The operative, who spends months teaching children their alphabet, begins to see herself partly as a teacher, even as she catalogs which families might be willing to take risks, which fathers have the resources to pay passage fees, which mothers have relatives already in Israel who could receive them. The role becomes a second skin, and in the next phase, that routine would harden into something larger. Names, chains, and a framework designed to survive scrutiny. In 1955, Israeli leadership authorized a clandestine apparatus that would later be known openly as Mossad, active from 1956 to 1964, to support and facilitate Moroccan Jewish migration. The public record ties its establishment to figures at the top of the Israeli state and intelligence world, including David Ben-Gurion and Mossad chief Isser Harel, with Shlomo Havilio identified as the head of the organization in Morocco. The decision emerged from a calculation that legal emigration channels might close at any moment, and that preparation for covert alternatives was not paranoia but prudence. After Moroccan independence in 1956, the operation's center of gravity shifted. What had been possible under colonial conditions became politically radioactive under a new sovereign state, navigating Arab League pressures and post-colonial legitimacy. The framework's function was logistical and human: connect communities, create channels, maintain discretion. Public accounts indicate the use of clandestine migration methods by land and by sea, but the record is uneven on operational granularity, often describing capability without preserving full procedure. The Atlas Mountains offered overland routes. The Mediterranean coast offered maritime ones. Both carried risks that the framework learned to calculate through trial and error. The structure that emerged was cellular by necessity. Local contacts, often members of the Jewish community with no formal Israeli connection, served as intermediaries between families and the framework's inner circle. Messages moved through coded phrases. Meeting points rotated. The appearance of normalcy remained paramount. One later account describes operatives maintaining day jobs in commerce while running nighttime logistics for departure groups. A merchant who spent his afternoons selling textiles might spend his evenings coordinating boat departures. The two identities existed in parallel, each protecting the other through plausible deniability. The emotional architecture of this period matters as much as the organizational chart. Operatives and local contacts had to live normally while preparing outcomes that could not be publicly named. A cafe conversation about weather could pivot, with a single phrase, into instructions for a family's departure timeline. The stress of that double existence accumulated invisibly: no leave policy, no psychological support, just the constant requirement to perform ordinariness while orchestrating escape. The motif begins here as bureaucracy. Documents that demanded faces, photographs, and consistency proof that a person is who the paper says they are. A clandestine operation is built from ordinary days stacked like bricks until the wall is high enough to hide a door. But walls create their own pressure. Soon, the struggle would move from streets and safe rooms to conference tables and recorded minutes. On 9 November 1959, in Jerusalem, a formal meeting on Morocco took place that would later be cited in scholarship as a window into the tensions behind the rescue pipeline: diplomacy, community politics, intelligence urgency, and the limits of public narrative. A summary preserved in the Central Zionist Archives is cited as listing participants, including Isser Harel, World Jewish Congress leader Nahum Goldman, and other senior figures alongside Shlomo Havilio and Aryeh Levantin of the Mossad. The gathering represented multiple institutional interests, attempting to coordinate a response to a situation that defied coordination. This chapter is documentary stillness, papers on a table, a debate that does not sound like a thriller but determines what the field can do. The dispute was structural. Emigration as humanitarian imperative. Emigration as political liability. Emigration as a question of state-to-state friction. Even when sources do not provide verbatim dialogue, the existence of the meeting and its archived summary anchors an undeniable reality. People argued about this in rooms where decisions became policy. The arguments were not abstract. They shaped whether families could leave, by what routes, and at what risk. The Jerusalem Conference revealed fractures within the rescue coalition itself. Some participants reportedly favored diplomatic patience, letting Morocco's new government find its own path to allowing emigration. Others insisted that waiting meant abandoning families who wanted to leave immediately. The Mossad representatives, according to later reconstructions, pushed for continued covert action, regardless of diplomatic temperature. Intelligence apparatus and diplomatic corps rarely share identical timetables. What seems like reasonable patience from a foreign ministry desk looks like abandonment from a Casablanca living room. On the ground in Morocco, that translated into uncertainty. Networks continued, families waited, and the covert world became a holding pattern. The motif sharpened, identity reduced to lists and forms, while the lives behind the names remained unrecorded. A child's name on a departure manifest tells nothing about whether she cried at the border, whether she understood where she was going, whether anyone explained what Israel meant beyond a word adults whispered with hope. Bureaucracy preserves categories, not feelings. Bureaucracy can be its own kind of violence, slow, polite, and capable of postponing rescue until rescue becomes tragedy. The cover kept people alive, but it also trained them to accept a double life as normal, and that normalization would later exact its own price. The postponement would not last. In early 1961, Morocco's throne changed hands, and the sea delivered a warning no memo could soften. By 26 February 1961, Morocco had a new king, Hassan II. Public historical summaries frame his accession as a turning point that made negotiations over Jewish emigration more feasible after a period of restriction. The target in this act is not a single man with a gun, it is a system. The exit ban, the bureaucratic gatekeeping, the political fear of appearing to collaborate with Israel in a region where that carried consequences. The system was impersonal, but not without architects. It functioned through decisions made by officials who weighed regional pressures against domestic concerns. Some accounts emphasize that Morocco had banned Jewish emigration to Israel from 1959 until February 1961, influenced by regional politics and Arab League pressures. What matters narratively is the lived effect. Families who did not know whether to pack, whether to wait, whether the next week would tighten or loosen the rules. A prohibition is not merely legal text. It is daily anxiety reproduced in every household that considered leaving, the fear of being caught preparing, the fear of being left behind if others found ways out, the fear that the window might never open again. Here, the operative world and the community world overlapped in a quiet, morally complicated way. A clandestine framework existed partly because open departure was politically impossible. Yet clandestine movement itself became a political liability. If exposed, it could invite crackdown, and if it failed, it could become public catastrophe. Families navigated this uncertainty without access to the intelligence assessments that shaped their options. They made decisions based on rumors, on trust in intermediaries they could not fully verify. The bureaucratic apparatus that controlled departure was diffuse and unpredictable. A passport office in Casablanca might operate differently than one in Marrakesh. A border crossing might be permeable one week and sealed the next. For families attempting to leave, every administrative interaction carried risk: the wrong question from an official, a neighbor's denunciation, a sudden policy shift announced without warning. The uncertainty extended to the covert networks themselves. Operatives could not promise success, only effort. The motif became oppressive. Photographs could be a path out or a trace that implicated everyone left behind. A passport photo taken for a legitimate purpose became evidence if plans changed or if the wrong official examined the file. Documentation, in a surveillance state, is always double-edged. Necessary for movement, dangerous if intentions are discovered. When the target is a policy, the enemy is often faceless, and that makes moral certainty harder, not easier. In January 1961, the faceless system met the physical world: a boat, a shoreline, and a failure that could not be negotiated away. On 10 January 1961, according to some summaries, or 11 January 1961, in other accounts, the vessel known as Pisces, remembered as Egos, sank after leaving the Al Hoceima area bound for Gibraltar, part of a clandestine effort tied to Ha-Miscaret. Sources differ on precise casualty counts. Figures commonly cited include 44 or 46 dead, and they differ on whether the date is recorded by departure night or by the early morning sinking. What the record aligns on is scale and consequence. Dozens of lives lost, many of them children, and a political shockwave that forced the story into the open. Accounts describe a rough crossing and a rapid sinking. They also describe rescue efforts involving multiple authorities and the grim fact that not all bodies were recovered. The waters of the Gulf of Al Hoceima, cold and indifferent, turned a covert operation into a mass grave. The darkness that had promised concealment became the environment of death. Some survivors, pulled from the water by fishing vessels or Coast Guard patrols, became witnesses to an event the framework had hoped would remain invisible. Their testimony, fragmented by trauma and translation, entered the historical record unevenly. In the international press, Morocco was blamed. Moroccan officials pushed back. The record also preserves the political exploitation. Golda Meir, then Israel's foreign minister, publicly held Moroccan authorities responsible, while Moroccan officials blamed clandestine Zionist activity for inciting departure. The disaster became a diplomatic incident, a propaganda weapon, and a human tragedy all at once. Each side used the deaths to advance arguments that had been forming long before the boat left shore. The dead became symbols before they could be properly mourned. The families who waited on shore for news that never improved lived a different experience than the diplomats exchanging accusations. For them, the disaster was not a talking point but an absence, a father who did not return, a daughter whose body was never recovered, a grandmother whose final journey ended not in the promised land but in the Mediterranean depths. The counting problem that sources present 44 or 46 is also a grief problem. Some families may never have known for certain whether their relatives were aboard. Later, another layer emerged. A report made public in 1993 is described as attributing the sinking to operational malfunctions, including a communications problem involving a monitoring station in Paris, an internal admission that moral clarity is rarely clean in intelligence history. The motif became literal. In catastrophe, identity is confirmed through names, lists, recovered bodies, and absence. The sea does not care about politics. It turns secrecy into a headcount. After the disaster, the operation did not become louder, it became more careful, and the next moves would be made with children. From March to July 1961, in Casablanca, a different kind of covert workaround took shape. Operation Mural, a Mossad-linked effort to move 530 Jewish Moroccan children out under the cover of a holiday trip to Switzerland, in coordination with a children's aid organization. The best-known named participant in public accounts is David Littman, who ran the Casablanca office undercover, and later became associated with the operation's published narrative. Public summaries also name Mossad agents Gad Shahar and Pinhas Katsir as participants who worked within the community to persuade parents to take the risk of separation. A key documented timeline marker is the convoy period. From 26 June to 24 July 1961, children departed in several convoys, their travel framed as temporary while the real intent was permanent relocation to Israel via Switzerland. The operational premise required convincing Moroccan authorities that these were vacation trips, nothing more. Paperwork emphasized return dates that would never be honored. The deception operated on multiple levels. The operation's moral tension is built into the method. Parents asked to separate from children, trusting intermediaries and a promise they could not verify publicly. Some families would be reunited in Israel within months. Others waited years. Still others found that the separation became complicated by bureaucratic delays, by the parents' own inability to leave, by circumstances no one had anticipated. The separation was presented as temporary sacrifice for permanent safety. But the children boarding buses did not understand geopolitics. They understood only that their parents were waving goodbye. The recruitment process required delicate persuasion. Community contacts approached families known to be considering emigration. The pitch combined urgency. Children can leave now, even if adults cannot, with reassurance the separation will be brief. Reunion will follow. Some parents agreed immediately, seeing the operation as a lifeline. Others hesitated, unwilling to send children into uncertainty without accompanying them. The decision to separate a family, even temporarily, is not made lightly. The fact that many parents agreed speaks to the fear that motivated them. The motif here is both innocent and cruel. In later accounts, even the public advertising was part of cover something shown to authorities more than to families, while recruitment happened quietly through community contact. A child's passport photo, taken in a Casablanca studio, became simultaneously evidence of innocence and instrument of deception. When children travel alone, the operation's success can still feel like a kind of wound. The convoys proved something to both sides. Morocco could look away, and Israel could move people without a headline. The target was never only a policy. It was the fear that policy produced fear strong enough to make parents gamble with separation, and strong enough to make operatives confuse necessity with permission. Next, the story shifted to negotiation, money, deniability, and the mechanics of legal secrecy. By early May 1961, public summaries describe Isser Harel, then head of the Mossad, deciding to entrust the Morocco file to Alex Gatman, chief of the Miscaret in Morocco, to pursue contacts that could turn clandestine departure into a controlled channel. Negotiations intensified after Hassan II's accession and in the wake of the Igaz disaster's political fallout. The sinking had demonstrated the cost of purely covert operations. The question now was whether a hybrid arrangement, secret but coordinated with elements of the Moroccan state, could function without the risks of midnight boat crossings. In accounts that name the Moroccan side, the negotiation circle includes figures such as Abdelkader Benjaloun and Moulay Ali Alawi. Some narratives also name Jewish intermediaries, including Sam Benazaraf and Dr. Isaac Cohen Olivar in the negotiation process. The conversations required trust on both sides, or at least the calculation that mutual benefit outweighed mutual suspicion. Morocco wanted the Jewish emigration question resolved quietly. Israel wanted emigration to continue. Both sides could find interest in an arrangement that satisfied those goals. The operation's ethical ambiguity surfaces in the reported financial arrangement: an upfront payment and a per capita fee structure tied to departures, with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society serving as a humanitarian facade for processing and plausible deniability. The documentary stance here stays restrained. Sources describe the arrangement, but they do not preserve every meeting location or verbatim bargaining line. What can be shown is the logic. Morocco wanted discretion and compensation. Israel wanted throughput and quiet legitimacy. Hias became a buffer that allowed both sides to speak in humanitarian vocabulary while conducting what was essentially a negotiated population transfer. Money changed hands across a negotiating table that officially did not exist. Per-head payments transformed human beings into accounting units, a morally uncomfortable fact that the operational record preserves without commentary. Yet the alternative, continued illegal crossings with their attendant drownings and arrests, carried its own moral weight. The families waiting to leave were not consulted on the ethics of the payment structure. They wanted departure, and the mechanism mattered less than the result. The motif turned bureaucratic. Photographs as the currency of permission, proof for a passport, proof for a list, proof for an exit. The same image that could condemn a family under one policy could save them under another. Documentation became the bridge between aspiration and movement. Secrecy is not only a method, it is also a contract one both sides can deny after they benefit. Contracts require machinery. Next came the front door: offices, stamps, collective passports, and the man in the Interior Ministry who could make paper move. By autumn 1961, in Casablanca, the operation's public face mattered as much as its covert intent. Accounts identify Raphael Spanian as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society's representative in Morocco, and describe negotiations involving Colonel Mohammed Ofkir in connection with the issuance of collective passports through the Ministry of Interior. The operational pivot was subtle. Families processed as families. Movement routed through third country steps described as necessary for political cover and regional optics. Morocco could not be seen facilitating emigration to Israel. The mechanics described broadly in public summaries included assembling families, getting them documented and photographed in Casablanca, and then moving them outward via maritime or air routes that did not force Morocco to declare direct cooperation with Israeli immigration. Details like specific vehicle models, safe house interiors, and routes are often absent or inconsistent in open sources. The narration treats these as unknown rather than filling them in. What is documented is the scale. Thousands processed through a system that officially did not acknowledge its own purpose. This is where psychological erosion began to show without invented interior monologue. The record demonstrates scale. Large numbers required repetitive processing. Repetition is a form of stress: same questions, same photographs, same fear behind eyes that have learned not to ask too much in the wrong place. Processing centers in Casablanca became assembly lines of human documentation. Each family passed through stages: verification, photography, paperwork, waiting. The operatives who ran these stages saw hundreds of faces. The families saw only their own singular departure. The role of Colonel Oufkir, later notorious for other reasons in Moroccan history, illustrates how rescue operations intersect with power structures that carry their own moral complications. The man who facilitated Jewish emigration would later be implicated in coup attempts and human rights violations. The operative who enables rescue today may enable repression tomorrow. The official who signs exit permits may sign arrest warrants for others. The framework worked with the structures available, not with the structures it might have wished existed. The motif became haunting. A lens pointed at faces that might never be seen again in Morocco. A flash that was both documentation and farewell. The photography studios of Casablanca processed thousands of passport photos during this period, children squinting at unfamiliar lights, parents attempting neutral expressions while their stomachs churned with fear and hope. Each photograph was a threshold image. The face leaving Morocco, about to become the face arriving somewhere else. When rescue becomes a pipeline, compassion can start to feel like administration, and administration can dull the senses that once felt everything. A pipeline needs a start date. Next, the operation received an official name and began moving tens of thousands under a secrecy both states insisted was not happening. On 28 November 1961, Israel launched Operation Yachin, described in historical summaries as a Mossad-led operation coordinated with Moroccan authorities to facilitate discreet emigration. Over the life of the operation, generally dated from late 1961 to 1964, public accounts often cite a final figure around 97,000 Moroccan Jews leaving under the framework, many traveling via France or Italy, with some settling outside Israel. The operation is repeatedly described as benefiting from Hiaz's role and from understandings at senior levels, including David Ben-Gurion and King Hassan II. Operationally, public summaries emphasize selection and sequencing, priority for families, passports issued collectively, processing centered in Casablanca, and onward travel by ship or air through intermediary countries. The narration stays careful. It describes the documented shape without claiming a specific pier number, ship name, or departure roster unless a source explicitly supplies it. The logistics were substantial. Moving nearly 100,000 people over 3 years required transportation networks, documentation systems, and coordination across multiple countries. This is where the documentary's emotional duality sharpened. In daylight, Casablanca was traffic, markets, offices, school runs. In the operation, daylight was also paperwork and quiet assembly points. Families carried normal household objects because that is what a household has: blankets, photographs, modest luggage. Departure was rehearsed as routine: board a bus, present papers, answer questions calmly even when hearts raced and hands trembled. Children were instructed to behave normally. Adults were instructed to show no emotion at checkpoints. The scale of Yachin transformed it from operation to migration. 97,000 people is not a covert action. It is a demographic shift. Yet it functioned through the vocabulary of covert action: discretion, deniability, intermediary channels. Flights departed from airfields where no Israeli flag was visible. The architecture of mass movement was built on the premise that no one would officially acknowledge what everyone involved knew. The contradiction was sustainable precisely because both states found it useful. For the families departing, the experience was compressed into moments of transition: the last look at a childhood street, the handoff of keys to neighbors, the crossing of a gangway, or the climb into an aircraft cabin. Some left property behind, expecting to return for it. Most never did. The departure was permanent, even when it was not described as such. Possessions sold hastily fetched low prices. Landlords who knew a family was leaving had leverage to reduce offers. A mass exodus can occur without a single public parade if everyone involved agrees that silence is the price of movement. Movement at this scale changed the host country and the receiving country. By 1962 and 1963, Operation Yachin's defining feature was not a single dramatic moment, it was sustained throughput under political constraint. Public summaries describe periodic pauses tied to economic effects, including concern over capital withdrawal as large numbers departed. Other accounts note external facilitation, including help passing through third countries and the importance of keeping the nature of the operation secret to avoid regional retaliation. Where sources disagree on emphasis or omit operational mechanics, the narration keeps the uncertainty visible rather than smoothing it into certainty. This is where the psychological deterioration thread is shown through documented structure rather than invented feelings. The record shows repetition and secrecy as operating conditions, a covert framework embedded in civic life for years, processing thousands of families. Even without a diary line that says the strain was breaking people, the conditions suggest a recognizable human arc. Cover identity maintained too long, the operational self that cannot rest, the domestic surface that keeps functioning because it must. The operatives lived dual lives for years. The toll of that duality does not require invention to suggest. The pauses were themselves sources of anxiety. When processing stopped, sometimes for weeks, families who had already sold possessions and said goodbyes found themselves suspended. Return to normal life was impossible. Departure was delayed. The operation's rhythm was determined by political calculations in Rabat and Jerusalem, not by the readiness of the families waiting. A pause that seemed brief from a policy perspective felt endless from a living room where the furniture had already been sold. For operatives and intermediaries, the years of Yachin accumulated as a kind of slow erosion. The same conversations repeated with different families. The same reassurances offered despite uncertainty. The same photographs taken of faces that blurred together after thousands of similar portraits. The work was necessary, but numbing. The repetition that made it efficient also made it emotionally deadening. Compassion fatigue is not a modern invention. It existed in Casablanca processing centers before it had a clinical name. The communities remaining in Morocco watched the departures with mixed emotions. Some saw neighbors and relatives leave with envy. Some saw them leave with relief. Some saw them leave with grief. The social fabric frayed as families divided between those who left and those who stayed. Synagogue congregations thinned. Schools lost students. The merchants who remained found fewer customers. The artisans who remained found fewer commissions. A community hollowing out does so gradually, then suddenly, the motif transformed again. At first it was proof of life, photos for papers. Now it became memory management. Faces archived, lists stored. The uncomfortable knowledge that an operation measured in numbers is carried out one family at a time. Success at scale can still feel like moral vertigo because every efficient process risks making human lives look like units. The operation would reach its end, not with celebration, but with an exhaustion that looks like normalcy. The question would become, what did secrecy save, and what did it erase? The final phase of Operation Yachin operated without fanfare. By early 1964, the flow of departures had slowed, not through dramatic closure, but through the gradual exhaustion of those who wanted to leave and could navigate the system. The framework that had processed tens of thousands now handled hundreds, then dozens. The machinery wound down as the supply of emigrants diminished. Processing centers that had hummed with activity became quiet offices where paperwork accumulated without urgency. For the operatives who had sustained the pipeline, the end brought its own disorientation. Cover identities that had been maintained for years no longer served purpose. Relationships built under false premises could not simply transition to honesty. Some operatives returned to Israel to careers in intelligence or government. Others found the readjustment difficult. The skills of deception do not easily convert to civilian normalcy. The person who spent years as someone else may find that the original self has changed in the interim. The communities left behind in Morocco were transformed by subtraction. Neighborhoods that had been majority Jewish became remnants. Synagogues that had served hundreds now counted congregants in dozens. The ancient Jewish presence in Morocco, predating Arab conquest, predating Islam itself, continued, but as a fraction of its former scale. Those who remained had chosen to stay, or found themselves unable to leave, or arrived at the decision too late to join the departing flow. Some stayed for business reasons, some for family ties to non-Jewish spouses, some because they felt Moroccan first and Jewish second. The departure also reshaped the receiving country. Israel absorbed nearly 100,000 Moroccan Jews over 3 years, a significant demographic addition that brought its own cultural and social adjustments. The newcomers arrived with languages, customs, foods, and expectations that did not always match the existing population. Integration was uneven. Some thrived quickly, others struggled for years. The children who had left on Operation Mural convoys were teenagers by the time Yachin ended. They straddled two worlds without fully belonging to either. The operation functioned because it hid inside ordinary life. But ordinary life is not built to carry this much secrecy without leaving fractures. The fractures showed in the communities divided between those who left and those who remained, between those who went to Israel and those who went to France or Canada, between those who prospered and those who struggled. They showed in the families separated across continents, reuniting in unfamiliar landscapes, carrying memories that younger generations would only hear as stories. They showed in the operatives returning home from years of performed identity with no ceremony and no parade. The departure that redefined a community did so through absence, not presence. The streets of Casablanca and Fez and Marrakesh looked the same. The buildings stood. The markets continued. But the doors that no longer opened told a different story. By spring 1964, Operation Yachin is generally described as ending, with public counts commonly placing the number of Moroccan Jews who left under the operation around 97,000. The outcome is visible even without dramatization. Morocco's Jewish community, ancient, diverse, locally rooted, was radically reduced within a few years. Some accounts cite different totals depending on whether they count those who went to Israel only or those who also settled in France, Canada, or the United States after traveling via Europe. The narration names the figure and also acknowledges the counting problem. Politically, the aftermath was a balance of narratives. Morocco could present itself as having managed an internal issue quietly, without openly breaking regional taboos. Israel could present the operation as rescue, while critics framed the per capita payment structure as ethically compromising. In a restrained dossier tone, the viewer is not instructed what to conclude. They are shown that intelligence history often forces humanitarian outcomes through morally ambiguous channels. For operatives and intermediaries, the end of a long operation did not necessarily bring relief. It could bring emptiness. The cover life that once felt temporary had lasted long enough to become familiar. Leaving it could feel like loss. Some found the transition to acknowledged identity more difficult than the years of deception. When people disappear quietly, a street can look unchanged until you realize whose doors no longer open. One absence refused to stay quiet, the dead of the sea. Decades later, a king would authorize a final movement that turned secrecy into public mourning. In December 1992, King Hassan II authorized the transport of the remains of those who drowned in the Igos sinking for reburial at Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Public summaries treat this as a striking postscript. The same state that once restricted or politically constrained emigration later permitted a gesture of closure across borders. The bodies moved when politics allowed, and mourning became a kind of record. The victims are commemorated in Israel as Ma'apile Egos, with a designated memorial date often referenced as the Hebrew date 23 Tevet. The documentary tone here is quiet and exacting. The reburial is not proof of innocence or guilt. It is proof that history does not stay sealed. 30 years after the sinking, Remains crossed the Mediterranean again, this time with official sanction, this time without secrecy. The gesture carried political meaning for both governments, but for the families, it carried something simpler: the ability to visit a grave. In 1993, a report described in later summaries was made public, stating that the Eagle's sinking resulted from a series of operational malfunctions, including a communications problem involving the monitoring station in Paris. Even at distance, the implication is sharp. Clandestine rescue is not automatically heroic just because its intent is rescue. It can also be negligent, rushed, imperfect, human in the worst ways. This chapter ties the psychological thread without inventing confessions. The record shows that secrecy can protect a pipeline, but it can also delay accountability. A long operation creates a professional reflex. Keep going. Do not stop. Do not expose. Over time, that reflex can hollow out the moral clarity people thought they had at the beginning. In the dossier, it is malfunction. In a family, it is a chair that stayed empty for decades. The motif becomes elegiac. Photographs in families' homes now serve a different function. No longer documentation for travel, now evidence of who was lost, and proof that the story is not only about borders, but about names that survived on paper. The final echo mirrors the opening image stripped of innocence. Not a triumphal flag, not a concluding speech. Just an object that belongs to paperwork and to memory. A passport photo on a table, flash-faded, no date written on the back. The face in the photograph belongs to someone who once waited on a dark shoreline, or to someone who processed the waiting, or to someone who never made it across at all. The image remains. The context fades. Children who grew up in Israel or France or Canada carry these photographs in drawers and albums, artifacts of a journey they may barely remember. The story ends where it began, with a face, a photograph, and the quiet weight of what secrecy can never fully carry.